Saturday, June 22nd, 2024. A sunny morning in Little Havana, Miami, Florida. David Martinez had been looking forward to this weekend project, fixing the cracked and uneven concrete sidewalk that led from the street to the garage of the house he and his wife Linda had purchased just 3 weeks earlier. David, 41 years old and a construction contractor by trade, knew that the sidewalk was more than just an eyesore. The concrete had settled unevenly over the decades, creating sections that tilted at dangerous angles. Linda had already tripped once, catching herself before falling, and David didn't want to risk an injury to her or their 2 young daughters. The house itself was beautiful, a charming Mediterranean revival-style home built in the 1960s, with arched windows, a clay tile roof, and a courtyard garden. It had been owned by the same man for 56 years before he'd passed away in March. The family selling the house had been honest about needed repairs, and David had gotten a good price because of the work required. The sidewalk was David's first improvement project. He'd rented a pneumatic jackhammer for the weekend and had spent Friday afternoon marking out the sections that needed to be removed and replaced. The plan was straightforward. Break up the old concrete, remove it and the gravel base beneath, compact fresh gravel, and pour new concrete. At 9 a.m. Saturday morning, David had fired up the jackhammer and begun breaking apart the old concrete. The slabs were about 4 inches thick, typical of construction from the 1960s. The work was noisy and dusty, but David was making good progress. By 11 a.m., he'd broken up most of the damaged sections and had begun removing the chunks of concrete and the gravel base beneath them. At 11:30, while scooping out gravel from a section near the garage entrance, David's shovel struck something that made a sound distinctly different from stone. Hitting stone. It was a dull thud, followed by a tearing sound, like fabric ripping. David stopped and knelt down to investigate. Using his gloved hands, he carefully brushed away more gravel. What emerged made his stomach turn. It was plastic, thick black plastic sheeting of the kind used in construction, deteriorated and brittle with age but still intact enough to recognize. And through tears in the plastic, David could see something that made him scramble backward and pull out his phone to call 911. Bones. Human bones. A skull, partially visible through a gap in the plastic. Ribs. The curved bones of what looked like legs drawn up in a fetal position. All of it wrapped tightly and stuffed into a space approximately 3 feet by 2 feet. Buried directly beneath where the concrete sidewalk had been for decades. The Miami Police Department responded within 8 minutes. What had started as a simple home improvement project on a Saturday morning had become a crime scene. That would ultimately reveal one of the earliest chapters in Miami's violent drug trafficking history. Over the next 4 hours, police carefully excavated the remains. The body had been wrapped in multiple layers of heavy black plastic construction sheeting. Inside the plastic, the skeletal remains were largely intact, positioned in a tight fetal curl, as if the person had been forced into the smallest possible space before burial. The remains were transported to the Miami-Dade County Medical Examiner's Office for analysis. Initial examination revealed several crucial facts. The bones belonged to an adult male, approximately 25 to 35 years old at the time of death, and he hadn't died of natural causes or an accident. Lodged in several ribs and in the base of the skull were bullets, 9mm rounds, that had been fired into the victim at close range. This had been an execution. But the most revealing discovery came from something else found, wrapped with the body. Preserved by the layers of plastic and the concrete that had sealed it from moisture and oxygen for over 50 years, was a leather wallet. The leather had deteriorated significantly over 5 decades, But the wallet's shape was still recognizable, and inside it, partially protected by the wallet's layers and the thick plastic wrapping, were several items, some cash that had become brittle and discolored, a few business cards whose ink had faded almost to invisibility, and a Florida driver's license issued in 1971. The plastic card had yellowed and warped with age, but the photograph and text were still partially legible. The name on the license could be made out: Carlos Miguel Gutierrez. Date of birth: April 19, 1946. Address: an apartment building in Little Havana that still stood a few blocks from where his body had been found. A search of police databases brought up a missing person report filed on August 15, 1972, 52 years, 10 months, and 7 days earlier, by Elena Gutierrez, who'd reported that her older brother Carlos had failed to appear for the baptism of her infant daughter and couldn't be located. The case had never been solved. Carlos Gutierrez had simply vanished one day in August 1972, and despite his sister's efforts to find him, he'd never been seen again. Until now, when a homeowner trying to fix a cracked sidewalk had literally uncovered the answer to a 52-year-old mystery. But Carlos Gutierrez hadn't just been any missing person. According to police records from 1972, Carlos had been a known mid-level drug trafficker during the early days of Miami's cocaine trade. Before Pablo Escobar, before the cocaine cowboys. But when the foundations of what would become America's unofficial cocaine capital were being laid. And the house where his body had been found? It had been owned since 1968 by a man named Raymond Costa, who'd worked as a construction supervisor specializing in concrete work, and who, according to old police notes, had been a possible associate of drug trafficking organizations, though he'd never been arrested or charged. Raymond Costa had died in March 2024 at age 89, just 3 months before the body buried under his sidewalk was discovered. He'd lived in that house for 56 years, raised 2 children there, welcomed grandchildren who'd played on that sidewalk, and had apparently never revealed that a drug dealer's body was buried beneath the concrete his feet crossed every day. Before we continue, make sure you're subscribed to this channel and hit that notification bell. What happened in August 1972 involves the violent early days of Miami's cocaine trade, a young man who got in over his head, and a secret that stayed buried for over 5 decades. By the end, you'll understand how the sunny suburbs of Miami sometimes hide darkness beneath their surface. Carlos Miguel Gutierrez had been born on April 19, 1946, in Havana, Cuba, the oldest child and only son of Miguel and Rosa Gutierrez. He'd had one younger sister, Elena, born 4 years later in 1950. The Gutierrez family had been middle class by Cuban standards in the 1940s and 50s. Miguel had worked as a manager at a cigar factory, and the family had lived comfortably in a modest home in a Havana neighborhood. Carlos had been a bright child, good at mathematics, with dreams of perhaps becoming an engineer or accountant. But the Cuban Revolution in 1959 had changed everything. When Fidel Castro took power and began nationalizing businesses and property, the Gutierrez family had seen their comfortable life disappear. Miguel had lost his job. The family's savings had become worthless, and by early 1961, they'd made the painful decision that so many Cuban families made. They would leave their homeland and try to build new lives in America. The family had arrived in Miami in March 1961, when Carlos was 14 and Elena was 10. They'd joined the flood of Cuban refugees settling in what would become known as Little Havana, an area of Miami that quickly transformed into a Cuban enclave where Spanish was spoken as often as English, and where Cuban culture was preserved by people who hoped that someday, somehow, they'd be able to return home. But returning to Cuba became increasingly unlikely as years passed, and Castro's government became more entrenched. The Gutierrez family, like thousands of other Cuban refugees, had to accept that Miami was now home and that they needed to build new lives in a country where they'd arrived with nothing. Carlos had attended Miami Senior High School, graduating in 1964. His parents had hoped he'd go to college, but money was tight. Miguel had found work as a mechanic, earning a fraction of what he'd made in Cuba. Rosa had taken in sewing to supplement their income. College seemed like an impossible luxury. Instead, Carlos had started working, first at a grocery store, then at a warehouse, making enough money to help his parents and to start building some savings of his own. He'd been a handsome young man, charming and confident, popular with friends, and attractive to women. By his early 20s, he'd been living on his own in a small apartment in Little Havana, making enough to get by, but not enough to achieve the kind of success he'd dreamed about. That was when he'd been introduced to a different path to prosperity. Through friends in the Cuban community, Carlos had learned about opportunities in what was then a relatively new and explosively profitable business: importing and distributing cocaine. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, the cocaine trade in Miami was still in its early stages. It was before the massive cartels, before the violence, reached the epidemic levels of the 1980s, before cocaine became the defining drug problem of a generation. But the foundations were being laid primarily by Cuban exiles who had connections in Colombia, where cocaine was produced, and who saw an opportunity to make enormous amounts of money. Carlos had started small, as most people did, making deliveries, serving as a lookout, doing the low-level work that needed to be done. But he'd been smart and reliable, and he'd moved up quickly. By 1972, at age 26, Carlos had been what people in the drug trade called a distributor. He'd received shipments of cocaine from higher-ups in the organization, divided them into smaller quantities, and sold them to dealers who would sell to users. He'd also collected money and debts, sometimes using intimidation or force when necessary. It had been dangerous work, but it had paid well. Very well. Carlos had been making more money in a month than his father made in a year. He'd driven a new Cadillac, worn expensive clothes, and frequented the nightclubs and restaurants of Little Havana, where drug dealers were known to socialize. To the outside world, Carlos had appeared to be a successful young businessman, though anyone paying close attention would have known that no legitimate business could support that lifestyle for a 26-year-old. His sister Elena had known what Carlos was doing, though they'd never discussed it directly. Elena had taken a different path. She'd married young, had children, worked as a secretary, and tried to live a respectable, law-abiding life. She'd worried about her brother, had urged him to find legitimate work, but Carlos had always brushed off her concerns. "Don't worry about me, Hermanita," he'd tell her. "Little sister. I know what I'm doing. I'm going to make enough money to take care of all of us, and then I'll get out, I promise." But in the drug trade of 1972, Miami, getting out was rarely as simple as deciding you wanted to leave. There were debts, obligations, knowledge of operations that made people dangerous to their employers if they left. And there was always the risk that one mistake, one loss, one conflict could turn deadly. Carlos had made a mistake, or perhaps several mistakes. The exact details were lost to time, but by early August 1972, Carlos had owed $75,000 to the organization he'd worked for, an enormous sum equivalent to roughly $500,000 in 2024 money. Whether he'd lost product in a bust, failed to collect money from dealers, or spent organization money he shouldn't have touched, the result was the same. Carlos was in debt, and the people he owed weren't the kind who accepted excuses or extended payment plans. Raymond Costa had been 37 years old in August 1972, a construction supervisor with a specialty in concrete work. He'd been born in Miami in DTV 1935 to Cuban immigrant parents who'd arrived in the 1920s, and he'd grown up straddling two cultures, speaking English at school and Spanish at home, comfortable in both the American and Cuban-American communities of Miami. Raymond had learned the construction trade from his father and had worked steadily since his late teens. By the 1970s, he'd been supervising concrete crews for commercial and residential projects. He'd purchased his house in 1968, a nice Mediterranean revival in Little Havana, and had been making steady if not spectacular money from legitimate construction work. But Raymond had had connections to the Cuban exile community, and within that community, in the early 1970s, the lines between legitimate business and drug trafficking had sometimes been blurry. Raymond had never been a drug dealer, had never been arrested, had never been formally connected to any trafficking organization, but old police. Notes from narcotic investigations in 1971 through 1973 had mentioned him as a possible associate, someone who might provide services to drug traffickers, someone on the periphery who could be useful without being directly involved in moving drugs. And a man with expertise in pouring concrete could be very useful to people who sometimes needed to make things, or people, disappear permanently. To understand what happened to Carlos Gutierrez in August 1972, it's important to understand what Miami was like during that period. The city was in the early stages of a transformation that would define it for decades. The massive wave of Cuban refugees that had begun in 1959 continued through the 60s and early 70s. Little Havana had become a city within a city, a Spanish-speaking enclave where Cuban culture thrived and where many residents hoped that Castro's government would fall and they could return home. But within this community of exiles, another change was happening. Some people, a small but growing number, had discovered that importing and distributing cocaine could make them wealthy beyond anything they'd imagined in Cuba, or could achieve through legitimate work in America. The cocaine trade in 1972 Miami was still relatively small-scale compared to what it would become in the 1980s. There were no massive cartels yet, no wars over territory that would leave hundreds dead, no cocaine cowboys making headlines. But the infrastructure was being built, the supply routes were being established, and the violence that would eventually explode was already simmering beneath the surface. Organizations, you couldn't yet call them cartels, were jockeying for position. Territories were being claimed. People who crossed the wrong person or owed the wrong debt were disappearing. The Miami Police Department was beginning to notice the violence, but they were understaffed and often outmatched by criminals who had money, weapons, and no hesitation about killing. Carlos Gutierrez had been caught in this world. By early August 1972, he'd been in serious trouble. The exact nature of what had happened was never clearly documented, but what police later pieced together from witness statements and informant reports suggested that Carlos had lost a shipment of cocaine, whether through police seizure, theft, or his own poor judgment, and couldn't repay the THEE organization the $75,000 it had cost them. On Friday, August 10, 1972, Carlos had been seen at a popular nightclub in Little Havana having what witnesses described as a heated argument with two men that several people recognized as enforcers for one of the Cuban trafficking organizations. The argument had been about money. Witnesses heard Carlos pleading for more time, saying he'd get the money, asking for 2 weeks to make it right. The two men had told Carlos that his time was up. They'd wanted the money by Monday, August 14th. If he didn't have it, there would be consequences. Carlos had left the nightclub around midnight, visibly shaken. He'd told a friend that he was in deep trouble and that he was thinking about leaving Miami, maybe going to California or New York until things cooled down. That friend would be one of the last people to see Carlos alive. Sunday, August 13th, 1972, was supposed to be a happy day for the Gutierrez family. Elena's infant daughter, Carlos's niece, was being baptized at a Catholic church in Little Havana. It was a significant event, and Carlos had promised Elena he'd be there. He was the godfather. His presence was essential. The baptism was scheduled for 2 p.m. By 1:45, with the church filling with family and friends, Carlos still hadn't arrived. Elena had tried calling his apartment from a payphone, but there'd been no answer. By 2:15, they'd started the Ihi ceremony without him. Elena making excuses to her husband and the priest that Carlos must have been delayed. But when Carlos didn't show up at the reception afterward, and when Elena's calls to his apartment continued to go unanswered through Sunday evening and all day Monday, she'd known something was seriously wrong. Carlos would never have missed being godfather at his niece's baptism unless something terrible had prevented him. On Tuesday, August 15th, Elena had gone to Carlos's apartment. The building manager had let her in when she'd explained her brother was missing. The apartment had been neat, showing no signs of struggle or hasty departure. Carlos's clothes were still in the closet. His toiletries were in the bathroom. But some things were conspicuously missing: his wallet, his keys, and the small leather briefcase he'd always carried. Elena had found something else. Carlos's Cadillac was gone from its usual parking spot. A day later, police would find the car, abandoned near Miami International Airport, keys still in the ignition, as if Carlos had been planning to catch a flight, but had never made it inside the terminal. The police report filed by Elena on August 15, 1972, noted that Carlos was 26 years old, approximately 5 feet 10 inches tall, weighing about 170 pounds, with black hair and brown eyes. Elena had provided a photo showing a handsome young man in a suit, smiling confidently at the IKPP camera. The report also noted, because Elena had been honest, that Carlos was known to be involved in narcotics trafficking, and that he'd recently been experiencing problems related to drug debts. This notation effectively ended any serious police investigation before it began. In August 1972, when a known drug trafficker disappeared, the assumption was simple: he'd either run away to avoid his debts, or he'd been killed by someone in the drug trade. Either way, police resources weren't going to be devoted to finding him when there were dozens of similar cases and limited manpower. What the police in 1972 didn't know, couldn't have known, was that Carlos hadn't made it to the airport on his own. He'd been taken there, already dead, his car abandoned to create the impression that he'd fled Miami voluntarily. The actual events of August 14, 1972, would only be understood decades later, after Carlos's body was found, and investigators could piece together what had likely happened based on physical evidence and the timeline of events. Carlos had almost certainly been killed on Monday, August 14th, the day the organization had demanded their money. He'd been shot multiple times at close range in what appeared to be a professional execution. The bullets found with his remains were 9mm rounds, the kind commonly used in the type of handguns that drug traffickers of that era favored. After being killed Carlos's body had been wrapped in thick black plastic construction sheeting, the kind used to protect building materials or to line excavation sites. The wrapping had been thorough and professional, suggesting someone with experience in handling bodies, or at least someone who'd thought carefully about how to transport a corpse without leaving evidence in a vehicle. The body had then been taken to the house on the quiet residential street in Little Havana, the house owned by Raymond Costa, the construction supervisor who specialized in concrete work. Elena Gutierrez had been 22 years old when her brother disappeared, a young mother with an infant daughter and a husband who worked long hours to support their family. The loss of Carlos had been devastating not just emotionally, but practically. Carlos had helped support their parents, Miguel and Rosa, who were in their 60s and struggling to make ends meet. But more than the loss of support, Elena had lost her protector, her confidant, the brother who'd always watched out for her even as he'd made dangerous choices in his own life. And she'd lost him without understanding why or how, without being able to say goodbye, without even knowing if he was alive or dead. The police investigation into Carlos's disappearance had been, as Elena would later describe it, barely an investigation at all. A detective had come to her apartment once, had taken a statement, had asked if Carlos had any enemies. She'd said yes, many, given his work, and had suggested that Carlos had probably left town to avoid his debts. "But his clothes are still in his apartment," Elena had protested. "His car was found at the airport, but nobody saw him get on a plane. Someone must have taken him there." The detective had been sympathetic but realistic. "Mrs. Rodriguez," he'd said, "Elena had married and taken her husband's name. Your brother was involved with some very dangerous people. If they wanted him dead, we might never find his body. If he ran away, he's not going to contact you because that would put you in danger. The best thing you can do is try to move on with your life." But Elena hadn't been able to move on. For months, then years, she'd called the police department regularly asking if there'd been any developments. She'd called hospitals throughout Florida, asking if any unidentified patients matched Carlos's description. She'd called jails in case he'd been arrested under a false name. She'd checked morgues for unidentified bodies. In 1975, Elena had used money she and her husband had been saving for a down payment on a house to hire a private investigator. The investigator had worked the case for 6 months, interviewing people in Little Havana's Cuban community, trying to track down anyone who might have seen Carlos after August 14th. The investigator had learned that Carlos had indeed owed a significant debt to a trafficking organization and that people in that world believed he'd been killed. But nobody knew where or how, and nobody was willing to tell a private investigator or police anything specific for fear of retaliation. The investigator had finally told Elena what she'd been afraid to hear. "Your brother is almost certainly dead. I'm sorry, but I can't find him. Wherever his body is, whoever buried it, they did a good job of hiding it. You might never know what happened to him." Elena had spent the investigator's report money and had nothing to show for it except confirmation of what she'd already suspected. Carlos was gone, probably murdered, and she would never know where he was buried or who had killed him. The years had passed. Elena's daughter, the one whose baptism Carlos had missed, had grown up never knowing her godfather except from photographs and stories. Elena had had 2 more children. Her parents had died in the 1980s, both of them passing away without ever learning what had happened to their son. Elena's husband had urged her to let it go, to accept that Carlos was gone, and focus on the family they had. And gradually, Elena had stopped calling police, had stopped searching, had accepted that she would probably never know the truth. But she'd never forgotten. Every year on Carlos's birthday, April 19th, she'd light a candle at church and pray for his soul. Every year on August 14th, the day he'd disappeared, she'd remember the brother who'd protected her, loved her, and made terrible choices that had cost him his life. By 2024, Elena was 74 years old, a grandmother and great-grandmother living in the same Miami neighborhood where she'd spent most of her adult life. Carlos had been gone for 52 years. Elena had long since accepted that she'd die without knowing what had happened to him, until a contractor fixing a cracked sidewalk had found him buried beneath the concrete. While Elena had been searching for her brother through the 1970s and beyond, Raymond Costa had been living his life in the house where Carlos's body was buried beneath the sidewalk. Raymond had married in 1975, 3 years after Carlos's burial. His wife, Catherine, had been a teacher at a local elementary school, and she'd known Raymond as a hard-working, reliable man who'd seemed to offer the stability she'd wanted for a family. They'd had 2 children, a son, Richard, born in 1967, before Raymond and Catherine had married, from a previous relationship that Raymond had been supporting financially, and a daughter, Maria, born in 1970 in the early days of their relationship. Raymond had been a good father by all accounts. He'd attended parent-teacher conferences, coached his son's Little League team, helped with homework, and provided the kind of stable family life that many children of his generation had experienced. The family had gone to church together most Sundays at a Catholic church in Little Havana. They'd had barbecues in the backyard and holiday celebrations where extended family had gathered. Raymond's children had grown up playing in the front yard and driveway of the house, riding bicycles on the sidewalk, drawing with chalk on that concrete. Neither of them had any idea that a drug dealer's body was buried beneath their feet. In 1972, shortly after Carlos's disappearance, Raymond had obtained a building permit from the city of Miami to repair and replace damaged driveway and walkway concrete. According to the permit records, the work had been completed in mid-August 1972, almost exactly when Carlos had disappeared. This timing, which would seem suspiciously precise when examined decades later, had raised no concerns at the time. Raymond was a construction supervisor. Doing concrete work on his own property was perfectly normal. The permit had been issued without question, and the work had been inspected and approved by a city inspector, who'd noted that the concrete work appeared to be professionally done to appropriate standards. What the inspector hadn't known, what nobody except Raymond had known, was that beneath that professionally poured concrete was the body of a murdered drug trafficker wrapped in plastic and buried in a shallow grave. Raymond had worked in the construction industry through the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, eventually retiring in the early 2000s. He'd been known as skilled and reliable, someone contractors wanted on their crews. There had never been any hint of criminal involvement, never any arrests or investigations. The old police notes from 1971 to 1973 that mentioned him as a possible associate of drug trafficking operations had been buried in files that were never followed up on. Raymond had never been questioned about Carlos Gutierrez's disappearance. His name had never come up in the investigation, such as it was. Raymond had lived to see his children graduate high school and college, had attended their weddings, had welcomed grandchildren who'd visited the house and played in the same yard and on the same sidewalk where their grandfather had hidden evidence of a murder. When Raymond's wife Catherine had died in 2016, after a long battle with cancer, Raymond had continued living in the house alone, maintained it carefully, and had apparently never told anyone. Not his children, not his closest friends, not even a priest in confession, about what was buried in his front sidewalk. Raymond Costa had died on March 7, 2024, at age 89 from complications of pneumonia. He'd been hospitalized for a week before passing, and in that time, according to his children who'd been at his bedside, he'd never mentioned anything unusual, never made any confessions, never given any indication that he'd been carrying a terrible secret for 52 years. His children had sold the house to settle his estate. David and Linda Martinez had bought it in late May 2024, and less than a month later, the secret Raymond had kept so carefully hidden had been exposed when a contractor's shovel struck plastic-wrapped human remains beneath 4 inches of concrete. For 52 years, 2 parallel lives had continued in ignorance of each other. Elena Gutierrez had lived with the pain and mystery of her brother's disappearance, never knowing what had happened to him. And Ramon Costa had lived with the knowledge of exactly where Carlos Gutierrez was buried, a secret he'd carried alone for more than 5 decades. Elena's life after Carlos's disappearance had been marked by his absence. Every family celebration had felt incomplete without him. Every time her children had achieved something, graduations, first jobs, weddings, she'd thought about how Carlos would have been proud, how he would have wanted to be there. She'd kept photographs of Carlos throughout her house. Her children had grown up knowing they'd had an uncle who'd disappeared, though Elena had been careful about how much she'd told them about Carlos's involvement in drug trafficking. To her grandchildren, Uncle Carlos had been a mysterious figure from family history, someone who'd vanished under unclear circumstances. Over the decades, Elena had occasionally received what she'd call false hope, times when she'd thought there might be a break in the case. In 1986, during the height of the cocaine cowboys' violence, there'd been a series of bodies discovered in various locations around Miami, victims of the drug wars. Elena had called the police every time, asking if any of the bodies might be Carlos. None of them had been. In 1994, a man claiming to be Carlos had contacted Elena by phone, saying he'd been living in Mexico and wanted to reunite with his family. Elena's heart had soared until she'd met the man and immediately known he was an imposter, trying to scam money from her. The disappointment had been crushing. By the 2000s, Elena had stopped expecting answers. Carlos had been gone for 30 years, then 40. Most of the people who might have known what happened to him were dead or impossible to find. The Miami drug trade had changed completely. The Cuban exile organizations of the 1970s had been replaced by Colombian cartels, then Mexican operations. The people and organizations from Carlos's era were ancient history. Elena had made peace with not knowing, or at least had learned to live with the uncertainty. She'd focused on her children and grandchildren, on her church community, on building a life that wasn't defined entirely by loss. But a part of her had never stopped wondering, never stopped hoping that somehow, someday, she'd learn the truth. Meanwhile, Raymond Costa had lived with his secret. It's impossible to know what that burden had been like for him, whether he'd felt guilt or fear, or simply accepted it as a decision made in a different time under different circumstances. His children would later struggle with this question. How could their father have lived normally, seeming happy and well-adjusted, while knowing he'd helped hide a murdered man's body? How could he have raised a family in that house, hosted celebrations, lived an apparently moral life, while keeping such a dark secret? Richard Costa, Raymond's son, would tell investigators in 2024, "My father was a good man. He went to church every week. He was kind to his family and his friends. He worked hard his whole life. I don't understand how he could have been involved in something like this. But the evidence is there. I have to accept that he did something terrible, and I'll never understand how he lived with it. Maria Costa, Raymond's daughter, had been less willing to accept her father's guilt. "We don't know what happened," she'd insist. "Maybe someone threatened him. Maybe he had no choice. Maybe someone used his property without his knowledge. I can't believe my father would have willingly participated in covering up a murder." But the timeline was impossible to ignore. Raymond had obtained the permit for concrete work in July 1972. Carlos had disappeared in August 1972. The concrete had been poured in mid-August 1972. The correlation was too precise to be coincidental. And Raymond's background as a construction supervisor specializing in concrete, combined with the old police notes mentioning him as a possible associate of drug trafficking operations, created a picture that was difficult to dismiss. What seems most likely, based on the evidence, was that Raymond had provided a service to the organization that had killed Carlos. Whether he'd been paid for that service or had done it out of fear or obligation would never be known. But someone had needed a permanent solution to the problem of Carlos's body, and Raymond had had exactly the skills and opportunity to provide that solution. David Martinez had been excited about the house when he and Linda had first seen it in May 2024. The price had been reasonable for Miami real estate, and while the house needed work, David's background in construction meant he could do most of the repairs himself. The sellers, Raymond Costa's children, Richard and Maria, had been honest about the house's condition. The roof was in good shape and the foundation was sound, but there were numerous smaller issues that needed attention. Outdated plumbing fixtures, old appliances, walls that needed repainting, and the cracked, uneven sidewalk that David had decided to tackle first. On that Saturday morning in June, when David had started the concrete removal, he'd been thinking about how the repaired sidewalk would improve the house's curb appeal and make it safer for his wife and daughters. He'd been planning the rest of the weekend's work in his mind, mentally budgeting time and materials for the various projects. The last thing he'd expected to find was human remains. The moment of discovery would stay with David for the rest of his life. The sight of those bones through the torn plastic, the sudden understanding of what he was looking at, the surge of horror and disbelief that made him stumble backward, pulling off his work gloves with shaking hands to dial 911. There's a body," he'd told the IB dispatcher, his voice shaking. "I'm fixing my sidewalk and there's a dead body under the concrete. Human bones. I can see a skull. Oh, God, there's a person buried here." The police response had been rapid and professional. Within 20 minutes, David's quiet residential street had been filled with police vehicles, crime scene tape had surrounded his property, and neighbors had emerged from their houses to stare and speculate about what was happening. Linda had been inside the house with their daughters when the discovery happened. David had called her immediately after calling police, telling her to keep the girls inside, not to let them see what he'd found. Linda's shock had mirrored his own. They'd bought their dream house and immediately discovered it concealed a nightmare. The careful excavation of the remains had taken hours. Forensic specialists from the Miami-Dade Medical Examiner's Office had documented everything with photographs and measurements before beginning the delicate process of removing the plastic-wrapped bundle from the ground. Detective James Morrison, a veteran investigator with the Miami Police Department's homicide unit, had taken charge of the scene. He'd been with the department for 28 years and had seen many strange things. But a body buried under a suburban sidewalk for what appeared to be decades was unusual even by Miami standards. The preliminary examination at the scene had revealed several important facts. The bones were clearly human, appeared to be from an adult male based on size and structure, and had been wrapped in what seemed to be 1970s, era construction plastic. The presence of bullets among the ribs and in the skull indicated death by gunshot, likely an execution. When the wallet had been found, partially protected by the plastic wrapping, Detective Morrison had immediately recognized the significance. A driver's license from 1971 that identified the victim and showed he'd lived. Just blocks from this location suggested this was a local case, probably a drug-related killing from Miami's violent past. The missing person report from 1972 had been found in archived files. The report included photographs of Carlos Gutierrez that showed a young man who matched the age and description of the remains. Dental records, miraculously still available from a dentist who'd kept meticulous records that had been transferred to a new practice when he'd retired, provided definitive confirmation. The remains were Carlos Miguel Gutierrez. The investigation into Ramon Costa had begun immediately. Archived property records, preserved on microfilm in the 1980s and later digitized, showed Raymond had owned the house since 1968 and had obtained a building permit in July 1972 for repair and replace driveway and walkway concrete. The timing had been so suspicious that Detective Morrison had initially thought it might be too obvious. Could someone really have been brazen enough to get an official permit and then bury a body under legitimately permitted concrete work? But further investigation had revealed that this wasn't as strange as it seemed. In 1972, building inspectors hadn't been looking for bodies under new concrete. They'd been checking that the concrete met thickness requirements and was properly finished. An inspector wouldn't have been present when the subbase was being prepared, wouldn't have seen what was placed in the excavation before concrete was poured. Raymond had essentially hidden the evidence in plain sight, using legitimate permitted construction work as cover for disposing of a murdered drug dealer's body. And it had worked perfectly for 52 years, until age and weather had damaged that concrete enough that a new homeowner had decided it needed replacement. Elena Gutierrez had been contacted by Detective Morrison on June 23, 2024, the day after the remains were discovered. The detective had driven to her home, accompanied by a victim services coordinator, to deliver news she'd waited 52 years to hear. Elena had been watching television when they'd knocked on her door. When she'd seen a police detective and a woman in professional clothes on her doorstep, her first thought had been that something had happened to one of her children or grandchildren. "Mrs. Rodriguez," Detective Morrison had said gently, "I'm here about your brother, Carlos Gutierrez. We found him." Elena had stood frozen, not understanding. "Found him? Carlos? But he's been missing it's been 52 years. How can you have found him?" "His remains were discovered yesterday," Detective Morrison had explained. "We've confirmed the identification through dental records. I'm very sorry to tell you that your brother was murdered, probably shortly after his disappearance in August 1972. He's been buried under a concrete sidewalk at a residence in Little Havana all this time." Elena had been shown photos of the location, of the house where Carlos had been buried. She'd recognized the neighborhood. It was less than a mile from where she'd lived in 1972, less than 2 miles from where she lived now. Her brother had been there all along, so close but impossible to find. The news had been simultaneously devastating and relieving. Devastating to finally confirm that Carlos was dead, that he'd been murdered, that he'd been hidden away like garbage under concrete for over half a century. But relieving to finally know, to finally have an answer to the question that had haunted her for 52 years. Can I see him?" Elena had asked. "Can I see my brother?" Detective Morrison had explained gently that what remained after 52 years wasn't something she should see, that the image wouldn't match her memories of her brother. But he'd promised that she could have a proper funeral, that Carlos's remains would be released to her after the investigation was complete, that she could finally give her brother the burial he deserved. The investigation into Carlos Gutierrez's murder had been complicated by the passage of 52 years. Most of the people who'd been directly involved were dead. The drug trafficking organization that had operated in Miami in 1972 had been dismantled decades ago, its members killed, imprisoned, or scattered. Physical evidence, beyond the remains themselves, was essentially non-existent, but investigators could reconstruct the likely sequence of events based on what they knew about Carlos's situation in August 1972, the timeline of his disappearance, and the discovery of his body at Raymond Costa's property. Carlos had owed $75,000 to his organization. He'd been given a deadline, Monday, August 14th, to repay it. He hadn't had the money. On August 14th, instead of bringing payment, Carlos had almost certainly been taken somewhere by the organization's enforcers and executed with multiple gunshots. His body had been wrapped in plastic construction sheeting, readily available to anyone in the construction trade in that era, and transported to Raymond Costa's house. The timing had been perfect. Raymond had already obtained a permit for sidewalk work, had already begun excavating the old concrete, and needed only to place the body in the excavation and pour new concrete over it. The concrete work would have been completed quickly, probably within a day or two of Carlos's death. The city inspector had approved the work a week or so later, never suspecting that a murder victim was buried beneath the fresh concrete. Raymond's exact role remained unclear. Had he killed Carlos himself? The forensic evidence suggested probably not. The manner of death appeared to be a professional execution, and there was no indication that the killing had occurred at Raymond's property. More likely, Raymond had been contracted to provide disposal services using his construction expertise to create a permanent hiding place for Carlos's body. Whether Raymond had been paid for this service or had done it under duress would never be known. But given his apparent connections to the drug trafficking community and his specific expertise with concrete, he'd been the perfect person to solve the organization's problem of what to do with Carlos's body. For Richard and Maria, Costa, learning about their father's apparent involvement in hiding a murder victim, had been traumatic. They'd grown up believing their father was a hard-working, honest man who'd provided a stable, loving home for his family. The revelation that he'd buried a murdered drug dealer under their sidewalk and never told anyone shattered that image. How do you reconcile those two versions of someone? Richard had asked investigators. The father I knew would never have hurt anyone, but the evidence says he did something terrible. I don't know which version is real, or if both can somehow be true. The family had decided not to speak to media about the case, wanting privacy to process what they'd learned. They'd issued a brief statement through a lawyer. We are shocked and saddened to learn that our father may have been involved in concealing a crime. We extend our deepest sympathy to the Gutierrez family for their decades of uncertainty and loss. For Elena Gutierrez, finally having answers had brought a complex mixture of emotions. The relief of knowing what had happened was real, but so was the pain of learning how her brother had died and how callously his body had been hidden. I always imagined that maybe he'd been buried somewhere, Elena had told Detective Morrison, maybe in the Everglades, or dumped in the ocean, or hidden in some isolated place. I never imagined he was under a sidewalk in a nice neighborhood, in a place where families lived and children played. It seems so cruel, so disrespectful. She'd paused, wiping tears, then continued. But at least I know now. At least I can bury him properly. After 52 years, my brother can finally rest in peace. The funeral for Carlos Gutierrez had been held in September 2024, a small ceremony at the same Catholic church where his niece's baptism had been held in 1972. The baptism Carlos had never attended because he'd been murdered the day before. About 20 people had been present. Elena and her children and grandchildren, a few elderly members of the Cuban exile community who'd known Carlos or his parents, and Detective Morrison, who'd felt compelled to attend to represent the law enforcement effort to find justice, even 5 decades late. The priest who'd performed the service had spoken about the parable of the lost sheep, about how important it is to search for those who are lost even when the search seems hopeless. He'd noted that while Carlos's body had been lost for 52 years, his soul had never been lost, and that Elena's faithful prayers and searching had been a testament to the power of family love. Carlos had been buried in a cemetery in Little Havana, not far from where his parents were buried. Elena had chosen a simple headstone, with his name, birth, and death dates, and an inscription in Spanish, Nunca olvidado por su familia, never forgotten by his family. For David and Linda Martinez, the discovery had turned their dream home into a place they couldn't continue to live in. The house had been a crime scene for weeks. Media attention had been intense. Neighbors had looked at them with a mixture of sympathy and morbid curiosity. Every time they'd looked at the sidewalk, even after it had been completely replaced, they'd thought about what had been buried there. They'd sold the house in October 2024, taking a significant financial loss, but feeling it was necessary for their family's peace of mind. A developer had bought it, planning to renovate completely and flip it. Whether future owners would be told about the house's history was unclear. The case remained officially open, though no charges would ever be filed. Raymond Costa was dead, taking whatever truth he'd known to his grave. The people who'd likely ordered Carlos's execution were almost certainly dead as well, victims of the same violent world that had claimed Carlos. What remained was a story about the early days of Miami's drug trade, about violence and secrets, and about how the sunny suburban streets of America sometimes hide darkness beneath their surface. Carlos Gutierrez had become just one name among thousands of people who died in Miami's drug wars over the decades. But unlike most of those victims, his story had finally reached some kind of conclusion. The sidewalk in front of the house was rebuilt with new concrete in August 2024, 52 years almost to the day after Carlos's body had been buried. Beneath the original. This time, there was nothing underneath but compacted gravel and soil. But for those who knew the story, that stretch of concrete would always be more than just a sidewalk. It would be a reminder that sometimes the most ordinary places conceal extraordinary secrets, and that the past has a way of eventually revealing itself, no matter how carefully it's been buried. Elena Gutierrez visited her brother's grave every Sunday after church. She'd brought flowers and spent time talking to him, telling him about the family he'd never known, the grandnieces and grandnephews who'd never met him, but who knew his story now. "I wish you'd made different choices," she'd say to the headstone. "I wish you'd listened when I told you to get out of that life. But you were my brother, and I loved you. And I never stopped looking for you. I'm glad you're finally home." For 52 years, Carlos Gutierrez had been missing. For 52 years, Elena had waited for answers. And while the answers when they came were painful, they brought something Elena had needed desperately: closure. The mystery was solved. The question was answered. And Carlos, who'd been buried beneath concrete in an unmarked grave for over 5 decades, finally had his name on a proper headstone and a sister who visited regularly to make sure he was never forgotten.